Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a session of presentation about trials in the vineyard and also touching the topic of the freeze. If you don't know me, my name is Francisco Diaz. I am the viticulture specialist at Vineyard. And as I already mentioned, today we'll be talking about a couple of trials that we have done in the last couple of years. And we will mention as well a little bit of the freeze event. So, as I already mentioned, my name is Francisco Diaz, and today we'll focus in two different parts. We'll talk about different trials, and as you can see in the table of contents, we'll discuss two different trials. One was the leaf thinning trial, and another of crop load and potassium applications. And I think one of the topics that are the most important right now, and people will be quite interested, is the freeze event. Okay. So I will be presenting alone this time. So if you have any questions, please go to the bottom of your screen. You can see the feature Q&A, and you can write your questions, and I will be able to answer them at the end of the presentation. Okay. So let's continue, and we'll start with leaf thinning trial. So why leaf thinning? What's that and why to do it? Well, we have been presenting this and mentioning in the last couple of years through best practices sessions, and it consists of the partial or full elimination of foliage from the cluster area. Which is the cluster area? It's the fruit zone. It's where we'll have the grapes. Why? Because we want to increase the sunlight and the airflow exposure. This is a practical technique, especially early in the season for disease control and later in the season to improve fruit ripeness. So what we do, we increase the fruit exposure, as we already mentioned. We will be able to improve the sprayer penetration and will increase the fruit quality as well. And overall, the season can be extended with a complete elimination of leaves as well. Okay. So which are the objectives of this trial? Well, was to evaluate the overall impact on fruit and evaluate the different leaf thinning timings. Okay, so which varieties were used? Well, l'Acadie Blanc en route and Pinot Noir grafted on 10114. Both varieties were in good condition and producing. So how much leaves and from where? Well, at the beginning, the main goal was to eliminate 100% of leaves. Okay, we didn't want to have any leaf on the fruit zone. Why? Because to increase the exposure as much as we could. So which treatments we were planning? Well, control without management, obviously, just to leave all the canopy as much as we could without a handle, so cover completely the bunches. Deleafing before bloom and a deleafing at fruit set. I know there are two different timings that we are not used to do it in Nova Scotia, but we wanted to try. So what was measured? Well, mass analysis included polyphenols, yield per treatment, and we have also some petiole analysis to see if we impacted somehow there as well. So first of all, as I already mentioned to you, we wanted to eliminate 100% of leaves. We didn't want to leave anything there. But due to plant conditions, that was not possible. So we only eliminate 70% and only one side, and we choose the morning side. So as you can see in this photo, was a couple of shoots, many different places, and it was not so much canopy. In this case, maybe we can see a lot of canopy, but in another, in the other variety, Pinot Noir, was quite thin. So we decided to have a very light leaf thinning and all in the morning side. Again, when we did it before bloom and fruit set. L'Acadie and Pinot Noir have the same management. The idea is to have the same management to treat them as similar as we can to compare what happened. So what happened with Lacadi? Well, we saw mass analysis include the polyphenols and also the yield per treatment. So for our surprise, and actually was not a big surprise, we didn't see a lot of difference. Where in fungal disease management, have to admit that the treatment with the control without management, it had a slightly higher fungal disease compared to the other, but was not so big because the Vineyard manager had a very strict spray program, very carefully, was not overusing product, but was very careful when to apply. So that was able to keep quite clean the vineyard, even though we saw a slightly more there than on the other side. We saw a slightly difference of petrol analysis, almost nothing without statistical difference. And before bloom and fruit set, again, we didn't see a lot. And Lacadi and Pinot had the same management overall. Okay, already mentioned, but I want to highlight and reinforce that idea so you don't expect that we did something different. So what happened with Lacadi? Well, we had a pH and total acidity that didn't present a biggest difference, but in terms of malic and tartaric acid, diminished, but without statistical difference. So as you can see, we had the parameters of malic acid and tartaric acid in grams per liter. And on the top, you can see the control, the early leaf thinning at pre-bloom and late thinning at fruit set. And on the last column, you can see the difference of 21 and 2022. So you can see that on 2021, the leaf thinning didn't have a big difference between all the treatments, only slightly on the malic acid. Meanwhile, on 2022, it was slightly the same between the control. What happened? Even though we did a very tiny and very light management of the canopy, the plants, they continue growing, as you can imagine. So we cover everything. And when we do 70% of the leafing at the stage of pre-bloom or at fruit set, it covers immediately all the place. Second, please. So what happened with Lacadi? Well, the phenolic compounds increase with the leafing, but again, without statistical difference. So you can see the phenolic compounds were slightly higher, especially in 2021 on both treatments, but without statistical differences. Meanwhile, in 2022, were quite similar all the treatments. What happened again on the overall on the treatments? In 2021, we were able to keep everything quite managed on the same way. But in 2022, we had a slightly deleafing by the Vineyard crew. So that is one of the reasons why the numbers stay so slightly similar. On the other hand, on berry weight changed every year in opposite way. So for example, in 2021, you can see that the control has one of the highest weights and the leafing at fruit set was the lowest, okay? Meanwhile, on 2022, it happened the opposite. So what happened with Pinot Noir? Well, unfortunately, the Vineyard crew deleted the trial both seasons, so we weren't able to see the results. Even though phenolic compounds changed differently each season without statistical differences. So as you can see, in 2021, the values are quite similar, even the control was slightly higher. Meanwhile, in 2022, it was the leafing at fruit set. The Vineyard crew passed after almost at the end of July, everywhere when we already passed through every treatment, so the difference are not able to see. Before I continue, what else we did? We were measuring and timing how much time it was taking for each person to leave each panel. Just to give you an idea, the Vineyard was 4.5 by 9 feet, or 1.37 meters by 2.7 meters. And each panel had 4 plants. Average speaking, each panel with a 70% of the leafing only in the morning side, it took like a minute, okay? So 1 minute per panel was overall what was taking for a person without a lot of training and experience in the vineyard. How is translate that? That in 18 panels throughout 100 meters, it takes 18 minutes for a person. If I consider all the rows in a hectare, it is like 11 hours per hectare. So a person without a lot of training, it was taking 1 minute per panel. And if we make the calculation depending training system, in this case, the number of plants per hectare, it was taking 11 hours per hectare, or 4 hours and 27 minutes per acre. Okay, we wanted to measure this. It was important just to have an idea of how long it can take doing this de-leafing at this stage. Now I will pass to the crop load and potassium application. What's that and why to do it? Well, it's manage the crop load, consists of cluster thinning depending on plant conditions. It can accelerate fruit ripeness. This is one of the biggest advantages to be doing the crop thinning in the right times. Potassium applications has a role also increasing sugar accumulation and diminishing acidity. As you know, soil in Nova Scotia are generally low on potassium. So it's necessary a balance with calcium and magnesium. Again, you have to remember that when we have the cations, all these nutrients with positive charge, they need to be in certain balance. So if you have too low potassium and too much magnesium, it will be worse to potassium. But if you have a lot of potassium, but even higher the magnesium, it can be also negative. And this will be mentioned throughout the presentation as well. So it's necessary to have an equilibrium between crop load and potassium applications to obtain fruit quality. So objectives, it was to evaluate the impact of crop load and management on fruit quality. Evaluate the impact of different potassium timing on plant health and fruit quality, and evaluate the relationship between crop load and potassium application. Which varieties were used? L'Acadie Blanc en route and Chardonnay grafted on 3309. Both were in good conditions and producing. When crop thinning, how much potassium? Well, we did the thinning before berry touch, okay? Slightly earlier than that. And the idea at the beginning was to combine the application to the soil and to the canopy at different times. But I will mention soon what happened. So we modify for 4 liters per hectare according to the label of one producer. So which treatments were used? Well, we had a control with and another without management. We have an early and late potassium application, and thinning and no thinning. So as you can see in this table, it was control without thinning, with thinning, potassium application before veraison without thinning, potassium application before veraison with thinning, and potassium application at veraison without thinning and with thinning. So what was measured? Mass analysis included cations, yield per treatment, and petiole analysis. First, as I already mentioned to you, we had to modify our first idea, which was combining soil and foliar applications of potassium. It was not possible to apply potassium to the soil because through soil analysis, we saw that the levels were quite high, where we did the analysis at NSTA. And there they showed the levels of potassium were quite high. So, because we were aware of the situation and we didn't harm and damage the plant health, we decided just to spray light potassium rate, which is the 4 liters per hectare that we already saw. And Lacadie and Chardonnay had the same management. We didn't want to modify or make more changes, so we proceeded in that way. So what happened with Lacadie? Well, we did mass analysis, which included the polyphenols, yield per treatment, and petiole analysis. So as a result, we almost no difference on petiole analysis due to competition with other nutrients. And we already mentioned at the beginning that it's important to keep in mind how's the concentration of calcium and magnesium as well. Both vines behaved differently to potassium applications. And again, Lacadie and Chardonnay had the same management. Why I mentioned all the time that Lacadie and Chardonnay had the same management? Because even though we proceed on the same way, each plant have different requirements and react differently. Okay? So what happened with Lacadie? Well, Brix and glucose to fructose ratio had some differences. So as you can see, Brix, which is the same as soluble solids, and glucose fructose for season 21 and 22. On the top, you can see the name of each control and each treatment. Excuse me. As you can see, each year we had some differences. For example, on the first year, the control presented a big amount of Brix. It was only one of the lowest, but for our surprise, the lowest was the early potassium without thinning. Meanwhile, the highest was the early potassium with thinning. In terms of glucose fructose, the highest one was again the early potassium with thinning. On 2022, it was quite similar with thinning, and early potassium presented good results. In terms of pH and total acidity, we didn't have big differences. And for malic and tartaric acid diminished, but without statistical differences. As you can see, on the left, you can see the malic and tartaric acid, which are grams per liter. And each row, it shows you the amount for in each control and per treatment. Again, as we already mentioned, we didn't see big difference. Mainly in 2021, we saw some, especially on the early potassium without thinning. Overall, not so much. And on 2022, they were not so big either. So the alcohol increased with thinning and applications. So again, this is the percentage of alcohol for 21 and 22. And you can see how the levels increase on the treatments with early potassium with thinning. And we have even statistical differences with the other treatments. That it was also repeated on 2022. And if you can pay attention, even the late potassium with thinning presented some increase of alcohol. In terms of potassium, the potassium increase on the mast. You can see here parts per million unmasked in both controls and the treatments, and especially in 2021, in the early potassium with and without thinning, you can see how the levels increased more. But it didn't increase so much the following season, and the values were quite similar. Okay? Something important to mention is that the vineyard manager, the winery, was practicing soil management on 2021, and they did it early in the season. However, on 2022, they didn't repeat that. It was the year that they were going to work every second row, but they decided to do it after harvest. So that it can be something to keep in mind and consider for this treatment. Also, on 2022, the number of applications were higher, and when we were doing the applications as well, we have more precipitation. That is something else to consider when we are doing this kind of application. So overall for Lacadie, the early application and thinning gave good results. And even though we don't want to thin, one good strategy is to apply a small amount of potassium, depending the conditions of the soil and the plant, to supplement this missing nutrient, and it can impact in a positive way in the alcohol accumulation. So what happened with Chardonnay? Well, Petion analysis showed similar values and considerable higher than Lacadie. So for example, in Lacadie, if we were having 1.4%, in Chardonnay, we had 3, 3.5, 3.6%. So that's why I wanted to mention that each variety behaves differently depending on the conditions. The mast analysis were quite similar. In terms of total acidity and pH, were quite similar and without statistical differences. Okay, so as you can see, we have the total acidity in grams per liter and the pH. And the values are quite similar without a big difference. Neither in 21 nor 2022, we were able to see a big change. The potential alcohol responded in a positive way, but without statistical difference. As you can see, again, similar to the previous one, we can see the alcohol for all the treatment 21 and 22. One of the biggest values, even though, were the late potassium with and without thinning. However, we didn't have statistical differences on these treatments. And again, if you can see, the control with thinning presented usually higher values. Also, just to let you know, even though we were trying to do crop thinning on Chardonnay, just to make some difference, the idea it was to leave only 2 bunches per shoot. We were unable to do it quite big because the plants were quite even. So between the control and the thinning control, it was a tiny difference of crop. It was at the edge to be statistical different. Okay, that is something to keep in mind. Why the numbers they don't look so different is because at the end there was not so different neither the crop yield. So what happened with Chardonnay? Well, potassium on mast increased without the statistical difference. Again, as you can see, it's possible to see a slightly bigger, higher values on late potassium and with and without thinning compared to the other treatments. This is interesting because it shows that the plant behaved differently than Lacadie. So early applications and thinning gave good results. So before moving on the next part, because I was unable to add this table on the presentation, what I mean with no thinning in Lacadie, no thinning was like around 4.4 kg per plant, okay, on 2021 and 2022. Even though we did a crop thinning, the Vineyard crew did another crop thinning, so that's why the numbers are in this way. In the terms of thinning trial, the values were around 3.6, 3.7 kg per plant. On the other hand, for Chardonnay, no thinning was around 2.4 kgs and thinning 2.3 kgs. Okay, I'm saying this very general. I'm not comparing each treatment, just to give you an idea of what we can expect or what I'm saying with thinning and no thinning. So this is one of the topics that it's quite negative right now. It has been impacting the whole industry. And a lot of my comments are based on a publication that we presented this morning through the Grape blog, thanks to Dr. Harrison Wright and Jeff Franklin and AFC, that they did all the analysis, plus the contribution of Perennia. A very nice article. So if you have time to read it, please take a look. Many of my comments in this presentation are based on that article. So overview. The event that we had at the beginning of February was the coldest event throughout Nova Scotia since 2009. It's the fourth coldest in 50 years in Canville. On the other hand, it's the warm start to winter. Average warmest on record for December and January, which is, it's quite shocking to see it. The temperature affected bad acclimatation. So even though it could be nice to hear about the warm beginning of winter, it had a very negative impact. So what happened? The grapevines were less hardy than previous years. As a consequence, the damage was 15 to 45% greater depending on varieties. So we have a considerable damage in all varieties, in all vineyards. So almost no vinifera production currently. And on hybrids, it will depend on how sensitive is the hybrid. For example, New York Muscat, one of the most sensitive, it can be almost 0. And on the other hand is Marquette, which is much more hardy and it can resist them. So how do we evaluate the bad hardiness? Well, all my comments are based on a presentation from Kevin Kerr and Jim Wilworth, which is already shared to you through the Grape blog at the beginning of February. So if you want to take a look closer to the original, to that presentation, you can take a look through the Grape blog. Anyway, I'm summarizing a couple of the steps and observations. So how we proceed? It's necessary to have 100 notes or buds per cultivar and site. For that, we need 10 canes or 10 buds each one. It must be from fruit canes, okay? We need canes that they were already producing next year and we're planning to leave on the vineyard for the following season. Must contain basal 10 buds of last year, okay? So try to don't take, if you haven't done this and you are starting right now, to take one extreme or something that doesn't look good. It's something that you were planning to take. So important consideration is buds need to thaw after freeze event. And this has to be like 24 to 48 hours of warming to allow the oxidative action. It's not just cut the shoot, go to inside and start to analyze. No, you have to wait, you have to be patient, minimum 24 hours, ideally 48 hours, and it has to be in warm temperatures, not at 5-6 degrees. Usually at room temperature at home, it will be the best. Why I'm saying this? Because some people already did the analysis super fast, and they weren't able to see the damage. And after they wait longer and they saw something completely different. So please remember that. So in this photo, it's just to show you how it looks. The primary bud, secondary bud, and the tertiary bud. Okay? So this is a very nice photo where we can see the depth of the primary bud, how it looks the secondary, which is alive, and the tertiary alive. So how we proceed? Well, we have to do different cuts, and it's necessary to go step by step with a very sharp razor just to cut very tiny slides and slowly just to be able to see. So this is the first cut where you cannot see a lot. This is the second cut, and you start to see some greenish color. Here's the third cut where you can see definitely the primary without issues. Fourth cut, you already see the primary, the secondary, and a little bit the tertiary. And here you definitely see everything and quite green. Careful, because some people is cutting immediately like the fifth cut and they see everything green and they think everything is healthy and in good condition. So it's necessary to go step by step. So what to expect? Well, first of all, and the most important is to assess your vineyard. You have to take a look and see what is happening there. So check each variety and block separately, okay? It's not one variety, it will be useful for the whole place. No, it has to be each variety and each block. We have to keep notes of how looks the area and the wood. That will be very important if you take a look of how is the wood and also you see a little bit the trunk. Also compare with your notes from last season throughout the season. Why? Because usually if you had some issues throughout the growing season, it's possible to see maybe more damage on the plants. And with that, I mean, if you have more fungal disease, if you have some water issues, I mean, with overstress, or you know you have some nutrient deficiency, it can impact differently to your plant. The same with crown gall. So hybrids will have different damage or behave differently. So we already mentioned that it can be sensitive ones like New York Muscat and Ceibal Blanc. And those ones, maybe they will not have almost nothing or not at all crop. After we have the medium hardy like Lacadie Blanc or Leon Milo, it can have a tiny amount of crop. And after they have the hardy ones like Marquette or Frontenac, which will be able to carry some more fruit, or actually, now we cannot talk about fruit, will have more bud viability. In the case of Vitis vinifera, which are the Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, they have more damage, and depending on the location, you can see even 100% damage. Okay, I don't want to discourage, just take a look carefully and objectively to see how are the conditions. So again, as we said, it's assessing your vineyard, and we are checking bud viability. Again, it's important to remind that having dead buds doesn't mean that it's a dead plant. It's necessary to go step by step to analyze. Less fruit will be on the primary buds, which means less production. Okay, so if you have less primary buds, obviously the production will be lower. Usually, as you know, we have the secondary and tertiary buds, but in Vitis vinifera, the secondary buds, they have almost no cluster and no production. On the other hand, hybrids can produce in the secondary and tertiary buds, but it's good to keep in mind on how are the conditions of each plant, just to try to keep a balance depending on the canopy and the fruit. In areas with grafted vines, check their conditions and track throughout the season and keep an eye for crown gall. Usually the grafted vines, ideally they need to be covered before winter. So if you didn't cover the graft union, please keep in mind that, take a look how it looks that area. Trunk damage, and I already show in this photo, one trunk of Lucy Kuhlman with slightly tiny damage. So depending the vineyard and location, it can present a damage. We cannot say a lot about it right now, so the only way to know what is happening is track throughout the season. Again, in this photo, you can see a trunk of Lucy Kuhlman. You can see a slightly and tiny crack in the middle, which we were expecting that it was maybe by the saw. So the vineyard manager proceeded to cut another trunk in another place and was very careful to don't do nothing with the saw, and it was able to see a little bit more of this damage. It's a potential vascular damage that can produce damage probably through the growing season, but we will not know until this season. Throughout the summer, we'll be able to see what is happening there. So, in terms of management, which is the main goal, is to recover a healthy vine. That is our objective this year mainly, more than focusing in production, especially in the plants that they have a big percentage of bud damage. So vines may die or collapse in a period of 2 to 4 years, depending on the conditions. That's why I'm encouraging to track vine health throughout the season, so you can keep notes of what or where it's happening the biggest movements in your vines. If you are already pruning and you already see areas of the trunk with damage like crown gall or a crack, remove that part. It will be recommended. these parts, they should be considered in the pruning process just to rebalance the plant. So we have other regions with experience in, for example, in Ontario, that they have experienced this a couple of times. So they said that vines with multiple trunks and heel had higher survival rates. Double trunks for tender varieties, it's recommended. It's recommended, okay? So in terms of management, how to proceed depending the bud mortality? Well, we had different options, and according to the literature, more precisely Wildworth 2014, he recommends a couple of things. So depending on the primary bud mortality, as you can see on the top, you will have different adjustments. So if it's between 0 to 15%, you can proceed as normal. If it's 16 to 30%, you can increase up to 50% the number of buds and break up renewal suckers to establish future trunks in case it's compromising the trunk. If it is between 31 to 50%, you can leave double the number of buds and use of kicker canes, extra canes or longer spurs, and bring up multiple renewals or suckers to establish future trunks. Remember that you can leave as much as you want, and after you can be fixing or managing throughout the season. It's better to have slightly more options than low. In the case if the damage is more than 60%, leave longer 6 bud spur or definitely don't prune. The idea is to bring up multiple suckers of scion bushes, any from above craft union. The idea is to have multiple options and to be sure that the plant is healthy, and if we have issues or damage on the trunk, we're able to reestablish the plant. So at the beginning of the season, consider how many buds are on the vineyard and evaluate the bud burst. Okay, important to know how many buds you have and evaluate bud burst at least in a couple of key areas. And again, consider per variety and block separately. No one specific variety for the whole block. So for example, if you have 2 different blocks of Lacadie 1, Lacadie 2. If you have one market, only one market. If you have 2 Chardonnay, put in a name, Chardonnay up and middle. In that way, you will be able to track and how it's behaving each area to see how is the evolution. Okay, so please, I encourage, I will repeat, have an estimation of how many buds are you leaving and evaluate the bud burst at the beginning of the season. Crop control. Well, keep in mind this per vine condition and not per acre or hectare. We are usually working per hectare or acre, but in this case, just to rebuild the plant, please consider case by case. So if you have a very weak plant, please don't leave all the crop, try to diminish or eliminate the crop at all. However, if you have a plant that is healthy, in good condition, don't eliminate all the crop because it will be the opposite effect, okay? And remember, overcropping can produce more collapse of the plant, and it can take even longer and more expensive to replace dead plants. In terms of fertilization, well, if you have damage, big damage, please do not fertilize because the plant, it has enough nutrients from the previous season and already without a big amount of buds for this year. So the plant, it can over-vigorize and it will have enough nutrients for the rest. So our goal is to avoid overgrowth and have bullwood or having wood growing only on the extremes because we want to have enough options for the next year to be able to lay down something. In terms of pest management, well, proper weed and disease management for a good recovery. I mean, we have certain thresholds that we have to respect. It's not just to leave, to be weeding all the time, to leave it 100% clean. No, the idea is to have different levels and to keep the plant as clean as we can, especially in terms of disease. And also keep an eye on crown gall and trunk diseases. So pay attention if you have a vineyard grafted, how is the graft union? Take a look if you have crown gall and start to see about the trunk diseases. Okay, that will be important after this year. And also search for cracks. If you are looking for cracks carefully and you have seen something now, make a mark or keep a note just to take a look how will be evolving that area through the growing season. So just to wrap up the conclusions for leaf thinning, well, Lac-A-D had less fungal diseases, less malic and tartaric acid, and more polyphenols. And the berry site varied each season. I told you as anecdotal, it takes 1 minute per panel of 4 plants, which was taking like, oh my God, my apologies. It takes like 11 hours per hectare or 4 hours, 27 minutes per acre. Sadly, in the case of Pinot Noir, we weren't able to see results due work from the Vineyard crew. In the case of for crop load and potassium applications, Lac-A-D treatment had more bricks, glucose and fructose, less malic and tartaric acid, and higher potassium on mast. The best results are early applications with and without thinning. On the other hand, Chardonnay treatment had more alcohol and higher potassium on mast. And the best results are late applications with and without thinning. Moreover, I mentioned to you that each variety behaved differently in the same soil conditions. So Chardonnay was able to uptake even more potassium than Lac-A-D. Something to keep in mind that is depending which variety and which plant and if they are grafted will behave differently. So you have to keep in mind that. For freeze event, well, the first step is to assess the vineyard, differentiating varieties and blocks. We have already publications on the grape blog about it, so please take a look if you haven't done. The sampling process is important, and also to have representative values, okay? So remember that we have all the bad hardiness reports published on the grape blog and on the Perennia website. So if you want to take a look, how was the minimum temperature and how is the impact on the LTE? Vitis vinifera had higher damage than hybrids, even though we have to practice scent management similar to both varieties. So pruning according to the number of bad damage. Take a look to damage on wood and consider that for pruning. If you have some crown gall or some cracks, please consider that as part of the process and eliminate it. Evaluate crop per vine and not per hectare or acre, just to take a look each situation, just to keep a good balance and avoid collapsing the plant. Diminish to avoid fertilization. Okay, we don't need a lot of fertilization if we don't have a lot of bats. And keep vineyard management practices. With that I mean weed management and pest and disease. And our main goal this season is to recover a healthy vine. Okay, the main goal is to have a healthy vine for next year. Now we are recovering. This way, I'm finishing my presentation about the trials and the freeze event. So if somebody has a question, you can write it on the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. Meanwhile, I can tell you that we are in discussions with AFC to have another presentation next week on March 1st, just to discuss in person about the results of the freeze, to have more a discussion about this topic, because I know many people is wondering what is happening and potential projections. So we are discussing, but try to keep in mind that is potentially next week on March 1st, I will be publishing that date on the grape blog. Okay, AFC has done a great job writing a report, which is already available on the grape blog, published this morning, and it can be found on the webpage at Perennia. I have one question, so from Patrick: how can we prevent this kind of winter damage in the future? Will be abscisic acid be an option? Thank you, Patrick, for the question. Well, sadly, this time the winter damage was, as already mentioned, a lot due to the winter conditions. December and January, they were not warm enough, so that diminished the acclimatization. Abscisic acid, it can delay the bud burst, but I'm not very sure it will increase the bud hardiness. Okay, so currently we don't have many options. We should have a good bud hardening after the harvest. The climatic conditions, they should be in our side. How we can prevent this? Well, option, it can be the geotextile. I have the impression that those ones, they will be in better conditions than the free ones. In another wine growing regions, like I think in Pili Island or in China, it's very well known and used. Bury the vines on the ground, which it's positive for the plants. So next question is from Parsai. So if you have 6 buds, how is the reaction with the apical dominance? It will depend where you have the buds, the Parsa. I think you mean like spurs. You can explain me a little bit more, because yes, it will be crucial. It depends how is the bud viability through the plant. So that will be, okay, yes. Well, it will depend a lot on the bud viability, and sadly, it will depend a lot on case by case. So now I'm going with Danny. Is there any efficacy in attempting scoring on vinifera trunks for latent bud firing external above the graft? Oh, such a good question. Thank you, Danny. So the idea is it will be to pay attention of what is coming from there. If many people has some spurs, so you will be able to conduct a new shoot for the following season. I'm not very sure. I read different things in different literature, so it depends on case by case. Sadly, I cannot tell you 100% sure on what it can happen. I'm hoping that the scion will come from the graft, and it's not only the rootstock starting to grow. I don't know if I answered your question, Danny. If you need something else, please let me know. Thank you. From Steve, it's, will general vine health have an effect on how fast a vine will recover? Yes, it will have an effect, Steve. So a weak vine, it will have more issues to recover. For example, if we have a vine with a considerable amount of crown gall, or if we have a big amount of fungal diseases previous season and the plant was already weak and it had green shoots, it will be slightly more difficult to rebuild that plant. The same if we have some issues on the graft union, it was not covered the previous season. I'm not saying it will happen, but the plant will be more susceptible to have some kind of damages there. So we have to keep an eye there. So health, it will have a role. That's why we have to be careful of how much nutrients or how much water we have on the ground, or how it's the fungal disease management through the season. So in that way, we pass through all the questions till now. I will keep you posted through the grape log, so please keep tuned. If we are able to arrange this meeting and session next week, and hopefully we can do it. It will be a combination between AFC and myself talking about what happened in the last couple of weeks, which are the current situation, and some more management practices there, so we can discuss more. Also, would like to encourage to read the report that it's already available on the grape blog. It appears amazing information about the current situation and some numbers of how is the bud viability through the season. So if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank your participation and coming to this event, and hopefully see you next week. Thank you.